My name is Gabriela Escobar. I am 70 years old, and I am a Latina woman who has lived her entire adult life in a house that I bought with hands rubbed raw from scrubbing other people's floors and fingers cracked from washing their dishes. I came to this country at 20 with little more than determination and the memory of my mother telling me in Spanish that a woman's strength is not measured in comfort, but in what she builds that endures. For decades I worked wherever someone would let me, ironing shirts until the steam burned my skin, cleaning kitchens until the smell of bleach clung to me, cooking in restaurants where my name was forgotten but my labor was always remembered. Every dollar I earned I stretched like dough, making beans and rice last for 3 days, patching clothes until they could patch no more, skipping new shoes so my children could have notebooks for school. I told myself that one day I would not be a woman lost in other people's houses. I would be a woman with her own, and I became her. With patience and sacrifice, I bought this modest home. Its walls are not grand, its floors are not polished, but every nail in its frame feels as though it was pressed into place with my own blood. This house became more than shelter. It was my sanctuary. My promise to myself that the years of exhaustion would not be wasted. When I turned the key the first time, I thought of Diego and Marisol, my children, who were still small enough then to chase each other barefoot through the hallway. I believed this would be theirs one day, not as a gift of entitlement, but as proof of what a mother's sacrifice can build. I filled the rooms with birthdays and Christmas tamales, with the smell of simmering beans on Sunday afternoons, with the sound of Diego's laughter when he learned to ride his bike in the driveway, and Marisol's soft voice practicing her school lines in the living room. For years, I lived under the illusion that the house would always mean to them what it meant to me, that they would one day cherish it the way I had cherished it, that it would hold their families as it had held ours. But now, in the quiet of my age, I find myself wondering if perhaps I mistook their gratitude for love, and their smiles for something that would last. The walls still carry the echoes of my sacrifices, but sometimes when I sit in the kitchen and listen to the clock tick, I wonder if my children will remember them at all, or if they only see numbers on a page where I see a life carved from survival. The first time I heard it, I thought I had misheard, because no mother ever expects her children to speak of her home as if it were already theirs to divide. I was sitting in the living room, the television humming low for company, when I heard Diego and Marisol's voices carry from the kitchen. At first it was harmless talk, the kind of murmuring siblings do when they think their mother is too old or too tired to listen. But then I caught the words that made my chest tighten. "What to do with the house?" Diego said, his voice heavy with calculation. "Not affection," Marisol answered with a sharp laugh, saying the market was good, that they could get a fair price, maybe even more if the walls were painted and the roof patched. I sat frozen in my chair, listening to them speak about the house I had built brick by brick, with sacrifice, as though it were nothing more than a number on a realtor's flyer. They did not say my name. They did not wonder what I might think. They spoke as though I were already gone, as though my heart had stopped beating, and they were free to trade my life's work away. I remember clutching the armrest so tightly my knuckles ached, because in that moment I felt as if the air had been stolen from my lungs. My children, the ones I had fed when there was barely enough for myself, the ones I had sheltered from storms, the ones I had carried on my back when I was too tired to carry myself, now spoke as though I were an obstacle in the way of their plans. I could hear Marisol's voice, quick and sharp, suggesting how easy it would be to list it, how she already knew someone in real estate who could help. Diego's tone was slower, more hesitant, but not enough to stop him from continuing the conversation. My eyes drifted to the photographs on the wall. Diego as a boy holding his first trophy, Marisol in her quinceañera dress, their smiles forever frozen in innocence, and I wondered when those children had disappeared. I wanted to rise from the chair, march into the kitchen, and demand to know what they thought they were doing, but my body would not move. Instead, I sat in silence, my ears burning with every careless word they spoke, words that treated me as if I were already a memory, a ghost lingering in a house they were impatient to sell. That night I lay awake long after the voices had faded, staring at the ceiling, the question circling my mind like a vulture. When had my children begun to see me not as their mother, but as a signature on a deed? It was a quiet evening when the truth stopped being whispers and became paper, cold and heavy on my kitchen table. I had just finished washing the dishes, my hands still damp, when I noticed a folder left open near my teacup. At first, I thought Diego had forgotten some work from his office, but when I leaned closer, I saw glossy pages filled with pictures of houses, prices circled in bold ink, and notes scribbled in the margins. These were not his dreams. They were plans for mine, as if my home had already been measured, appraised, and priced. My eyes caught on one number in particular, written in Marisol's tidy handwriting, with the words, "At least this much," underlined twice. My chest felt tight. The kind of ache you get when you are betrayed by someone you love so deeply that you never thought they could wound you. I sat down at the table, staring at the folder as though it might explain itself, as though the pages might lift their voices and confess why my children thought they could take the walls I had sweated and bled for. A moment later, Marisol walked in, her heels clicking against the floor, and without hesitation, she slid into the chair opposite me, picking up the folder with a casual ease that made my stomach knot. "You know, Mama, the market is strong right now," she said, flipping a page with her manicured finger, her tone light, almost cheerful. "Your house could sell for a good price, more than enough to help all of us." She did not say my house. She said her house, and the shift in language landed like a slap across my face. I forced a small smile, pretending not to notice, pretending to be the foolish old woman they believed I was. But inside, my hands curled into fists beneath the table. I listened as she spoke about renovations, about buyers, about how things could be divided, her words falling like stones into the silence between us. Diego wandered in soon after, nodding along, his eyes averted, as if he could not bear to look me in the face. The air grew heavy with their careless ambition, with their blind certainty that I would bow to their plans. I said nothing, only nodded, my throat too tight for words. When they left the room, laughing softly as though they had accomplished something noble, I remained at the table, staring at the empty space where the folder had Saturday. I realized then that silence was the only weapon I had for now. But deep inside, I also knew something darker. The children I had raised on arrows and prayers no longer saw me as their mother. They saw me as a door to be unlocked, a deed to be signed, a house to be sold. That night, after they left, I walked through my house alone, each step echoing louder than it should have, as though the walls themselves wanted me to remember what my children had already forgotten. I paused at the dining table, running my fingers over the wood worn smooth by years of meals and celebrations. Here, Diego once blew out candles on his 6th birthday. Chocolate frosting smeared across his cheeks, while Marisol clapped her hands with delight. Here, we gathered on Christmas Eve, passing tamales wrapped in husks, the smell of cinnamon and masa filling the air as we sang villancicos far off key. Now the table sat silent, a stack of bills replacing the laughter, its surface another number to them in a realtor's listing. I moved into the hallway, the walls lined with faded drawings from their childhood, stick figures holding hands beneath uneven suns, words spelled wrong but filled with love. My children had grown, But the evidence of their beginnings still clung here, taped crookedly, with the pride of a mother who saw beauty in imperfection. I stopped to trace one with my finger, the paper brittle under my touch, and I wondered how they could walk past these things without seeing, without remembering that this was more than drywall and paint. In the kitchen, the tiles still bore the chips from years of heavy pots set down too quickly, from Marisol dropping a plate in her rush to school, from Diego's soccer cleats clattering across the floor when he came running for dinner. The counters had scratches from my knives, scars of a woman who stretched beans, rice, and a few vegetables into meals that somehow fed us all. I looked at the stove, remembering nights I came home from work so exhausted I thought I would collapse, but still stood there, stirring, because I wanted my children to know the taste of love, even if it came from a weary hand. To them, the chipped tile and the faded paint are signs of something to be torn out and replaced. To me, they are proof that life was lived here, that sacrifice had shape and smell, that love was carved into every imperfection. My heart ached with the knowledge that my children no longer saw the home as I did. Where I see memory, they see profit. Where I see sacrifice, they see opportunity. As I stood there in the silence, I realized this house had become more my companion than my children ever were. It carried the weight of my love, but in their eyes, it had already been reduced to a price tag. Waiting for the highest bidder, the morning they brought a stranger into my home, I understood just how far my children had drifted from me. I was in the kitchen brewing coffee when the knock came, sharp and businesslike. And before I could reach the door, Marisol's voice rang out, bright and falsely warm, welcoming the man inside, as though she were the owner. I stepped into the hallway and saw him, tall and neatly dressed, a leather folder under his arm, his eyes scanning the walls as though they were inventory, not memory. Marisol beamed, gesturing toward the living room, telling him about the property and its potential, her tone so confident, so assured, that I felt invisible in my own doorway. Diego trailed behind them, his expression uneasy, his hands shoved into his pockets. But he said nothing to stop her. I followed quietly as the man walked through each room, scribbling notes, pausing to look at the sunlight streaming through the kitchen window, the same window where I had once watched Diego chase a ball down the driveway. I saw his pen move quickly over his paper, numbers flowing easily, where my memories felt heavy and irreplaceable. Marisol laughed, saying the house was a little outdated but solid, as if my sacrifices were nothing more than old paint and crooked tiles. I stood by the corner of the table, clutching my coffee cup with both hands, afraid that if I spoke, the anger in my chest would spill out like boiling water. The realtor glanced at me only once, with the polite but dismissive smile reserved for someone who is seen but not heard, and I realized he thought my silence was agreement. They all did. None of them saw that I was swallowing stones just to keep from screaming. When he asked if there were any recent repairs or issues, Marisol answered quickly, her words overlapping mine before I could even form them, and I saw the way her eyes shone, proud of herself, as if she had already won something. The man nodded, satisfied, as though he had been given permission to imagine this house without me in it. My heart ached with every scratch of his pen, every calculation scribbled without thought for the nights I cried into these walls, the mornings I rose before the sun to pay for the roof above their heads. When they left, shaking hands at the door, Marisol's laughter floated back into the house like a stranger's voice. I stood in the empty hallway, staring at the indentations on the carpet where their shoes had pressed down, and felt my chest constrict, as though they had not just walked across my floor, but across my very soul. My silence had been mistaken for compliance, but in truth, it was the silence of a heart breaking in its own home. That evening, I could no longer hold the questions inside me, so I called Diego and Marisol into the living room. The same room where they had once curled beside me on the couch as children to watch cartoons, where their voices once filled the air with laughter. I sat in my chair, my hands folded in my lap, and asked them the simplest question, though it came out heavier than I intended. Why are you doing this? Diego shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the floor, while Marisol crossed her arms, her chin raised as though she were the one who had earned the right to be weary of me. Diego finally spoke, his voice cautious but firm, telling me I could not take care of the place anymore, that the upkeep was too much for me, that the leaks and the creaks of an old house would only grow worse with time. He spoke as though I were fragile, as though the woman who had carried laundry up 3 flights of stairs for decades had suddenly grown too weak to turn a doorknob. His words landed like stones in my chest. Then Marisol added her piece, sharp and certain, telling me it was better for me to move into a smaller space, that I did not need so many rooms, that an apartment would be easier for me. She smiled when she said it, as if she were offering kindness. But I heard only dismissal, as though my life had become too large for me, as though the house that had been the cradle of their childhood was now an inconvenience standing in their way. Their words cut deeper than knives, not because of their content, but because of the way they were spoken, without tenderness, without remembrance of who I had been to them. I looked at their faces, so familiar, yet so distant, and I wondered when compassion had been replaced with calculation. I asked them if they remembered who had paid for the roof they slept under, who had skipped meals so they could have new shoes, who had bent her back until it ached just so they could stand taller. They avoided my eyes, their silence louder than any argument. I realized then that I was not fighting to keep a house. I was fighting to keep myself from being erased. I swallowed my grief and let the silence grow between us, but inside me, something shifted. For the first time, I understood that my children no longer saw me as their mother. They saw me as an obstacle. And obstacles were meant to be moved. That night I could not sleep. The silence of the house pressing on me like a heavy blanket I could not throw off. I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, the cracks in the plaster forming patterns that reminded me of roads leading nowhere. My children's words echoed in my ears, circling endlessly, telling me I could not take care of the place, telling me it was better for me to move to something smaller, their voices filled with certainty and emptiness at the same time. I thought of my mother then, a woman with hands tougher than leather, who scrubbed other people's laundry until the day her body gave out, but who never let go of the little shack she had in our village. She used to say in Spanish that the house was not just wood and walls, it was dignity, and dignity must be protected until the last breath. I remembered her bent figure at the stove, the way she would hum while stirring beans, her tired eyes still lighting up when she looked at us. Her children. She had nothing, yet she gave us everything. I wondered, in that moment, if sacrifice carries a curse, if the more you give, the more you invite betrayal from those who grow too used to your giving. My mother died with calloused hands wrapped around the keys to her home, determined to protect it even from the future. I, too, have calloused hands. And yet here I was, listening to my own children plot the sale of the very roof I had bled for. I turned on my side, closing my eyes tightly. But instead of sleep, I saw Diego's boyish smile when he once told me he would buy me a big house one day, and Marisol's small fingers gripping mine when she was frightened. Those children are gone, replaced by adults who now look at me with impatience, measuring my years instead of my love. I asked myself if this was the way of the world, if every sacrifice a mother makes becomes invisible over time, until she is seen not as a person, but as a burden. I felt grief rise inside me like a tide. But beneath it, there was something harder, something my mother had passed down to me in silence. It was the knowledge that even when the ones you love betray you, you must decide how much of yourself you are willing to let them take. And as the clock ticked in the dark, I whispered into the night that they could wound me, but they would not erase me, not while I still had breath in my body. The next morning I decided I could no longer live only in silence. So I gathered my papers into a worn envelope and went to see Arturo, an old friend I had known since my early days in this country. He was a boy from my neighborhood back then, one who used to carry groceries for the older women. And now he was a lawyer with silver in his hair and glasses that slipped down his nose. When I walked into his office, the smell of old books and strong coffee filled the air, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like someone might see me as more than a signature waiting to be taken. I sat across from him, my hands trembling slightly as I slid the envelope across his desk. He looked through the documents, slowly, carefully, then sighed and leaned back in his chair. "Cheng," he said, his voice low but steady. "Your children are trying to sell your house. They have already spoken to an agent. They are forging details under your name to make it look as though you have agreed." My heart sank, even though I had already known it in my bones. To hear the truth spoken aloud was like having salt poured into an open wound. I closed my eyes for a moment, picturing Diego's hesitant smile, Marisol's proud tilt of her chin, and I wondered how far from me they had drifted to betray their own mother this way. Arturo leaned forward, his expression both firm and kind. "But listen to me. It is not too late. They cannot touch your deed without your signature. You still have control. But you must move quickly before they find new ways to twist this." I felt my stomach twist with both relief and dread. There was still time, yes, but time now had a weight to it, a clock ticking louder than my heartbeat. Arturo placed his hand gently on mine, the gesture more like a brother than a lawyer. "You are not powerless," he said. "They want you to believe you are, but you are not." His words settled into me like a seed planted in dry soil, something small but alive that could grow if I let it. I gathered my papers once more, tucking them close to my chest as I left his office. The sun outside felt harsher, the city noisier, as though the world knew the battle I had just declared. My children had already tried to sell the ground beneath my feet, but now I knew their game, and I also knew that I still had choices they had underestimated. And for the first time in many nights, I walked home not as a woman abandoned, but as a woman preparing. When the truth settled into my bones that my children would not stop until the house was no longer mine, I decided that I would not wait for them to strike again. I remembered a family that had once rented from me many years ago, the Rivera family, good people who had fallen on hard times, but had always paid what they could, and had left the small unit cleaner than when they arrived. I remembered how the mother would bring me warm tortillas wrapped in cloth to thank me for being patient, how the father always fixed what was broken without charging me, how their children had drawn pictures of the little garden I let them plant. They had moved away, but word had drifted back through neighbors that they were still nearby, still steady, still kind. One evening, after staring too long at the papers on my table and feeling the weight of Diego and Marisol's voices pressing against my chest, I picked up the phone and dialed the number scribbled on an old envelope. When Mrs. Rivera answered, her voice carried the same warmth I remembered. And before I could even explain, she said, "Signora Cheng, it has been too long." I felt my throat close, tears threatening to spill, but I steadied myself. I told her I was thinking of selling my home, not because I wanted to, but because I needed to take control before someone else did. There was a pause, and then she said gently, "If you are serious, we would be honored." The next day, her family came by, and as they walked through the house, I braced myself for the cold, appraising looks of strangers, but instead, I saw respect in their eyes. They touched the walls gently, speaking of keeping the dining room intact, of not changing the kitchen too much because it had a warmth to it, of planting flowers outside so the home would always feel alive. They did not talk of profit or renovations, only of belonging. As I listened, something in me softened, though sorrow still burned underneath. I realized that if my children could not honor what this house meant, then perhaps another family could. It would not be theirs by blood, but it would be cherished. And maybe that was enough. That night, alone at the kitchen table, I lit a candle by the window and whispered to my mother's photograph that I had made my choice. If the house had to leave my hands, it would not be ripped away in betrayal. It would be passed with dignity to people who would remember it not as a transaction, but as a home. The day of signatures arrived sooner than I thought it would. And as I walked into the notary's office with the folder of documents pressed tightly against my chest, I felt as if I were carrying both a coffin and a cradle. My house, my sanctuary, the walls that had sheltered me through storms and laughter, was about to no longer be mine, yet it would also no longer be in the hands of children who had already betrayed me. I sat at the long wooden table across from the Rivera family, their faces calm and respectful, their voices low, as though they understood this was not just a transaction but the end of a life's chapter. The notary flipped through the pages with practiced hands, pointing where I needed to sign, his voice monotone, detached, as though he could not see the trembling in my fingers or the way my heart was pounding. Each time the pen touched paper, I felt a sting, as if I were cutting ties to decades of sacrifice, to nights of aching bones and mornings of rising before dawn. I thought of the chipped kitchen tiles, of the birthday candles blown out in the dining room, of the faded drawings still taped to the hallway wall, and for a moment I wanted to pull the papers back, to refuse, to shout that this was mine and would remain mine until the earth claimed me. But then I remembered Diego's quiet avoidance, Marisol's sharp certainty, the way they spoke as though I were already dead, and the fury that had simmered inside me for weeks rose up and steadied my hand. No, they would not take this from me. If I had to let go, it would be on my terms. The last signature slipped from my pen with a sigh that felt as though it came from my very soul. When the notary stamped the papers, a hollow echo filled the room. Final and absolute. I looked up at Mrs. Rivera and saw tears in her eyes, gratitude mixed with reverence. And in that moment I felt something like peace. Fragile, but real. The house was no longer mine, but it was no longer theirs either. And in that truth I found a small flame of victory. As I left the office, the afternoon sun struck my face, and though my chest ached with loss, I walked a little taller, knowing that I had chosen the ending myself. The day they came with their realtor, striding into my home as if it were already theirs to offer, I was waiting at the table with my hands folded neatly in front of me, my back straight, my breath steady. The house was already gone, though they did not know it, and as they entered, chattering with excitement, I felt a stillness settle inside me, the kind that comes only when you are holding a truth sharper than any knife. Marisol's heels clicked across the floor as she spoke quickly to the man at her side, pointing at the living room as if she were giving a tour, her words spilling with ownership that was never hers to claim. Diego trailed behind, his face flushed with nervous energy, his eyes darting toward me as though he knew something was about to shift. They had no idea that the signatures were already dry, that the notary's stamp had already sealed the future, that the Rivera family now held what they thought was theirs to trade. I let them talk for a moment. Let them show the stranger through my home. Let them rattle off imagined numbers and imagined plans, until their voices filled the air like a performance meant to erase me. And then, when the silence stretched just enough for me to step into it, I spoke softly, my words cutting through the air like glass. "You do not need to bother," I said, watching their faces turn toward me. "The house is already sold." The room froze, every sound swallowed. Marisol's smile faltered, her mouth hanging open as if the words had stolen her breath. Diego blinked, his face paling, his lips parting but no sound escaping. The realtor looked between us with confusion, his pen hovering above his pad, waiting for an explanation. I did not give them anger. I did not raise my voice. I simply held their eyes and let the truth sit heavy. It was my choice. I added, my tone calm but firm. And it is done. The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. The kind of silence that leaves no room for argument. Marisol's face twisted as though she had been struck, while Diego lowered his gaze to the floor, shame creeping across his features. The air felt thick, every breath sharp, as if the walls themselves were listening to the reckoning they had been waiting for. For the first time in weeks, I did not feel powerless. I felt like the woman who had carried this house on her back for 40 years. And as I sat there, steady in my chair, I watched their stunned faces and knew they finally understood that they had underestimated me, that the mother they had dismissed had not been erased at all, but had chosen her own ending with unshakable hands. The silence did not last long, because silence never does when guilt is cornered. Marisol's face flushed red, her voice rising like fire as she accused me of betrayal, her words cutting and hot, telling me that I had ruined everything, that I had destroyed the future she and Diego had planned. She spoke as if I were a thief, as if I had stolen something that was never theirs to begin with. Diego's voice soon followed, louder than hers, shouting that I had doomed him, that I had left them with nothing, that after all he had done for me, this was how I repaid him. His anger filled the walls of the house I no longer owned, shaking the air with bitterness. Their words fell over me like hail, hard and relentless. But instead of breaking me, each strike only reminded me why I had made my choice. I watched their faces twist with fury, the same faces I had once kissed goodnight, the same mouths that had once whispered, "Te amo, mama," into my ears when they were children. It was almost unbearable to witness how far those tender voices had traveled, now sharpened into knives of entitlement. My heart ached. Yes, but it did not falter. I let them rage until the room felt suffocated with their accusations. And then I spoke. My words came not with volume but with weight, a quiet edge that cut deeper than any shout. "You tried to erase me while I am still alive," I said, my voice steady, my eyes never leaving theirs. "That was your choice. This was mine." The room went still, as though even the air bowed to the truth of what I had said. Marisol's mouth opened, but nothing came out, her fury caught in her throat. Diego's hands trembled at his sides, his breath uneven, his anger suddenly stripped bare and revealed for what it was. Desperation. I could see in their eyes that they had not expected me to fight back, that they had believed I would fold as easily as the laundry I had folded for decades. But I was no longer the mother who carried their burdens silently. I was the woman who had carried herself through years of sacrifice, and who had now chosen to carry her dignity above all else. Their anger did not frighten me, it only proved how right I had been to take control before they could take everything. And as they stood there, fuming and stunned, I felt the strength of generations before me rising in my chest. Women who had been silenced, but had left me the courage to speak. In the days that followed, The news spread through family and neighbors, the way gossip always does, slipping through phone calls and whispered conversations at the market, carried by voices that were eager to weigh in on a story not their own. Some of my cousins called to tell me I had been reckless, that I had turned my back on my children, that a mother should never close the door on her blood, no matter what they had done. Their words stung, but they did not linger, because I could hear the distance in their voices, the way judgment often hides fear. Fear that they too might one day be betrayed by the children they raised. Others, though, were quieter, their voices soft with something that felt like respect. A neighbor came by with pan dulce and placed it on my counter, without many words, only a small nod and the whisper, "You did what I wish I had done." Another woman from church squeezed my hand after service and said, "You are braver than people will ever know." Their kindness did not erase the ache in my chest, but it soothed the edges of it, like balm on a wound that would take time to heal. Diego and Marisol, meanwhile, kept their distance. They did not call, did not visit, did not even send messages through others. I knew it was not because they had forgotten me, but because their pride was too heavy to let them face me. To admit what they had tried to do would mean confessing that their plan had failed, and failure was something neither of them could carry in public. I grieved for that silence, for the absence of my children's voices in my home, for the laughter that no longer spilled through my halls. At night, I sat at my table with a cup of tea and felt the loneliness seep into my bones. And yet, alongside the grief, there was something else, something I had not felt in many years. I breathed more freely. The weight of waiting for the next betrayal, of listening for whispers in the kitchen or watching for papers on my table, was gone. The house was no longer mine, but I had chosen its fate, and that choice had given me a freedom I did not know I still had the strength to claim. For the first time in years, the silence of my home felt less like abandonment and more like peace. When the time came to leave, I carried only what mattered, not the heavy furniture or the things my children once touched, but the pieces of myself that could not be replaced. I chose a small apartment, only a few blocks from the house I had fought so hard to protect. Not because I needed to look at it every day, but because I wanted to remain close to the neighborhood that had carried my history. The apartment was modest, a narrow kitchen, a single bedroom, and light that poured through a window onto the worn wooden floor. But it was mine, chosen by my own will. I unpacked slowly, setting each object down as if planting seeds of a new life. My mother's cooking pot took its place on the stove, still heavy with the memory of beans simmering for hours, the scent of garlic and cumin that once filled her home. My rosary, worn smooth by decades of prayers, hung by the bed, where I could reach for it in the quiet hours of the night. Photographs lined the small dresser, Diego and Marisol as children, smiling with gaps in their teeth. Myself younger with eyes full of dreams. My mother, in black and white, holding me as a baby in her arms. I looked at those faces and felt both the ache of loss and the warmth of survival. A reminder that I had carried us all this far, even when the road was rough. As I walked through the apartment, placing each item in its corner, I whispered to myself that this was not a story of defeat. It was not about the house that had been taken from my children's hands before they could steal it from mine. It was about the dignity I had reclaimed by refusing to be erased, about the truth that a woman's worth is not measured by the walls around her, but by the strength she carries within. I touched the cool surface of the window and felt the light on my skin, a light freer than any I had known in years, and I smiled through the tears that threatened to fall. My children may never forgive me, but forgiveness was no longer the currency I lived by. I had given them love. I had given them everything. And when they turned against me, I gave myself something at last. My legacy is not a house with chipped tiles and faded paint. It is the decision to live with my head lifted, to carve my own ending, to breathe without fear of being betrayed within my own walls. That is the story I will leave behind, and that is the truth I will carry with me until the very end.